Welcome to the Visible Art of Translation podcasts. This series of podcasts are part of the EU-funded INCREC project. Our focus is creativity, translation, and technology in literary and audiovisual translation. Our goal with this series is to give visibility to the often invisible skills, role, and voice of professional translators.
So today is a very special episode in the Visible Art of Translation podcast, as this is our Christmas special. In today's episode, I, Lisette Rauwelen, researcher and coordinator within the INCREC project, will be interviewing the main researchers of the project. Anna Guerberov, principal investigator, Xiaolu Wang, Nastya Saboltas, and Kio Gerrits, all PhD candidates within the project. We will learn more about the people behind the project and what their main drive is for the research they are carrying out. Welcome all to this very special episode. Could you all shortly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lisette. My name is Ana Guerberov Arenas, and I'm the PI for the INCREC project, and I'm an associate professor in translation technology at the University of Groningen.
And my name is Kio Gerrits, and I'm one of the PhDs, and I'm doing research on the creative process and reader reception, so how people react to creativity in the text across different technologies.
My name is Xiaolu Wang. I come from China. I'm also one of the PhDs. I obtained my master's degree in audiovisual translation from UCL, and now I am doing research on creative process in subtitling.
My name is Nastya. I'm also one of the PhDs in the project, and I study creativity in literary translation and specifically creative process in literary translation and the possible effects the technology can have on this process.
Yeah, thank you all very much for the wonderful introductions. And we're all working on the same thing, but also working on different things within the project. So I'm really wondering, can you briefly explain the motivation for your research and what is your research about in a few sentences? So I think, Anna, could you tell us a bit about the project?
Yes, so the INCREC project is a European research project funded by the European Research Council in an ERC Consolidator grant for 5 years. And my motivation for the project, or why I applied for this grant, was to know more about the creative process in translators and subtitlers, and especially to see if technology could help or hinder this creativity. There was background work that I had done with Antonio Toral here at the University of Groningen on another project that was called CREMT. And here we saw that post-editing machine translated content, when the machine translation is given to you by default, constrain the creativity of literary translators in 2 languages that we studied, Dutch and Catalan. So because of all this, I had the question, what would it happen if we provide the technology in a way that is more useful to translators? Would their creativity then be hindered or augmented? And also, of course, for me, there is no, in any translation study, there is not only the inception of translation, but also the reception. What do readers or viewers of this creative content think or experience, let's say, when a text is more creative or less creative? So basically, this was the motivation for the project.
Very interesting motivation, and I'm really curious about the PhDs. Nastya, can you tell us a bit more?
So my part of the project is about creative process in literary translation, and I'm specifically interested in what stages are involved in this process and what translators really do, because I have my personal motivation and my own curiosity, as I have worked as a literary translator before for some years. And when I translated, I never really thought what I did. But now I'm very curious to look at this process from a researcher's point of view. So it's something that I can now observe what translators do and also understand if they're similar in some regard or if they're different. So this is one of my motivations. One of my big motivations is my curiosity.
Okay, that sounds also really interesting because I think then you know both sides of the medal, so to say. And let's see, maybe Shalou can tell us a bit more.
Well, for me, one of the most important motivations is the worrying payment situation for subtitlers. Because same as Nastya, I was a subtitler before. We are paying less because some companies believe that we are using machine translation to pre-translate the text, and we only do the post-editing. But the situation is not like this. So I want people to know that the creative process happening in subtitlers' minds are irreplaceable and they should not be underrated. So my research is exploring what the creative process is in subtitling and how subtitlers' creativity and productivity can be affected by machine translation.
Okay, thank you. That's also very humble motivation. And last, Kyo?
Yeah, so I think in general, there is not really enough research done about how people engage or react to translations and why that is the case. So in general, I think we should look at that more because translations are literary text, of course, or they can be literary text. In our case, I at least look at literary text. And there has been some research done on how people engage with literary text, but not specifically really on translation or very little. So I think that is important already by itself because it's a big part of reading materials. And then, as Xiaolu and Nasha also say, we now see kind of this increase in use of machine translations or maybe even expectation of using machine translation, which impacts the field at large. And I think it's really important to see how that will influence how people read and our reading experiences in general, specifically related to creativity, because if we look at literary text, kind of this creativity factor is just so important in how we see creativity and literariness in a text. And that's, of course, also if you read a text yourself, you're like, oh, this text is so well written. It has so nice phrasing. So I think it's very important to see how machine translation deals with that and how people then react to it. And also to see if you use machine translation, how that influences translators in general and these texts in general. So I think it's important to have a look at the effects of it, not just on the translators, which is also very important, which is why it's part of the project, but also on how like the users, the readers engage with it, react to it, and why they like it or not. So that's basically what my research is about and what I'm doing for these years.
If I may add as well, because this is something that sometimes I think the general public might not know, is that because we are researchers, we are open to whatever the result might be. So our job is to think the best way to look at a problem, in this case, the creative process and technology, and we look at the best way to quantify sometimes this creativity or how to describe the steps of the creative process. But of course, we have to live with whatever the result is, in a way. We have to be impartial. So if the result is, machine translation is wonderful in this area and not in this other area, this is what we need to report. And this makes it more difficult because you are trying at all times to do something that is very thorough, rather than if you're a company and you're just trying to sell a product. And that's a very different type of, let's say, reporting, because then they say, oh, we tried this and it's wonderful, it's super productive. And we are looking here at reporting in all dimensions of translation activity. But we will have to report whatever we find. And then maybe some translators or users or whatever will say, well, I don't agree with that,
Yeah, the struggle of research.
Exactly.
We have to be very objective all the time, and we can just report the things that users want to hear, of course. But all your projects sound really, really interesting, and I can't wait to read about it in papers or whatever, so to hear about your findings. And I think the audience can really relate to that. So regarding the audience, why is it so important for our audience and the people in general, the research that you're carrying out?
Yeah, so I think for me, of course, as I mentioned, of course, I'm looking at the users and the readers. So I think that is already, there's this, of course, interplay. But I also think it's important for our audience and people in general to kind of understand translation a little bit better, because that's of course why we also have the podcast to kind of make visible this art of translation, as the title also suggests. Also, I think because what Anna was saying a second ago, there are so many kinds of translation, and I think that's sometimes something people can overlook. So Nasha and I look at literary translation, and Xiaolu looks at subtitling, so AVT. And I think that is different from other types of translations, nonfiction or like guidelines or something. And what you kind of see, I think, nowadays is that machine translation might be very useful for one field, or even useful for like less creative text. And so you kind of see this kind of attempt to kind of use it, but it's all a little bit all over the place because we don't always understand translation as well. And companies want to make money as easily as they can. They want to create something as cheaply as they can a lot of the time. Not all companies, of course, but definitely some of them. So I think it's important also for users generally to kind of not for users to understand, which is also nice, but for their own, for the products that they use, the translations they encounter, which is a lot, I think, if you think about it. So not just books or leaflets, but also if you watch like Netflix or Disney Plus, or even on your normal cable television, there is, of course, a lot of translation going on every single day. So I think it's important to kind of make sure the quality is understood, how that works and how we get around to all of these translations and the influence modern technology can have on that. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily negative. As Anna said, we already know it's going to be a bad thing necessarily, but it is important to look at the effects it has and the kinds of effect it has on users, both of the translation readers and the translators themselves, and how we should kind of deal with it and later on. So I think that's why this whole project is just very important for translation and then for the general public as well, because everyone engages with translation daily.
Yeah, it creates a kind of awareness, of course, that you are engaging with literary texts or Netflix or whatever you're using. And I think Xiaolu has to say something about it as well.
Yes, I totally agree with what Kale just said, because we want to know whether the viewers, well, I'm saying viewers because in my case, we are dealing with videos. So whether the viewers can notice the difference between subtitles translated by human translators from scratch, or post-edited by human translators, or translated by machine translation. Because like all of us go to the cinema or at least watch TV or YouTube, I believe none of us want the subtitles to be in bad quality because it will affect our watching experience in a negative way. So it can be related to anyone, and that's why we are doing reception studies.
Yeah, thank you very much, Xiaolu. And Nastya?
I agree with what Kio and Xiaolu said about the effects and the role of AI now and modern technology. But I was also thinking that there can be quite some misconceptions in general public around translation in general. For example, some people can say that, oh, machine translation is already so good that we don't really need human translators at all. And I see the importance of my research is to really show the role of humans in this process. And yes, Anna said we are open to any results. So I don't know if maybe machine translation will be very helpful for them, maybe not. But I would like to show it more clearly what really it is about, what translation is about, and specifically literary translation, because it also can be seen as something, oh, is it really very different from technical translation, for example? Because I think people sometimes also confuse different types of translation, and maybe, just a little bit lack of information and understanding, because there is so much new information about new technology that it overwhelms everything. So that's why I see that the role of human should be also stressed and emphasized.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think that people are aware when they're reading something or watching something, what the process is behind that. And if there's machine translation used or whether human translation is used. So I think, yeah, I do agree. And Anna, what do you have to add to this?
So I want to add that translation is a very interdisciplinary field, both in research and the actual field of translation. Like Kio was saying, you can watch a movie translated, you can read a poem, you can read a cookbook, or you can read Tolstoy, right? So or you can read your technical manual, on how to install your washing machine. So it's a very interdisciplinary field. But in the creative area, I think literary studies have looked into this, and reading experiments a little bit as well, that literature and creative content has a transformative effect on the user, on the person reading. But there is a layer that is often disregarded, and this layer is the added value of translation in this layer, because a lot of people do not read in the source language, in the language that it was written. Like, for example, our new literary novel prize, very few people are going to read in Korean directly. They are going to read her in translation. And this transformative effect is very important because it helps you to see the world in a different way, and it might help you to experience emotions that otherwise you wouldn't experience. So how can translation add to this experience or modify this experience, and how technology also can modify this experience? So, for example, yesterday I was in Amsterdam in Anne Frank's house. And of course, this book has been translated in more than 70 languages because not everybody can read Dutch. And I'm happy to say that they had the Catalan version and the Spanish version and many other languages in the store, very helpful. So to understand things like war or migration, refugees, status, what do people feel? You do it in many occasions through literature or through a movie, a documentary. So what users experience is not only the story, it's the language. And this is very, very important. We don't want to lose that as humanity. We want to keep this. I don't care if machine translation, I shouldn't say this, but maybe, but I don't care if machine translation can achieve this, fair enough. Okay, it's good, because then we have maybe a book that nobody would read from Norwegian into Catalan, translated with the help of machine translation. But is the experience the same? Or can machine translation be helpful in some areas and not in others? So we want to know more about kind of quite deep concepts that are important for the user, without the user necessarily realizing, oh, I'm going to study this, because it's not their job. It's our job to shed some light on what is your experience and what is your emotion when reading a text, for example, that has been translated by a professional or by a student or by a machine. And these experiences, we know already, are different. So this is what we are trying to do. And this is why translation is so important, but it's a bit invisible, as, this scholar Venuti used to say. And that's why we have this podcast that is the visible art of translation, because we are trying to make it visible to the general public through this podcast as well.
Yeah, I think that's very, very useful. And I think you just need translation, of course, to convey information from one side to the other, whether it's a documentary, like you said, Anna, or whether it's a text that you're reading, or a book just for pleasure, but you experience the wonderful story that someone has written in, for example, Catalan, also to experience that for Dutch speakers who don't necessarily speak or understand Catalan, for example. So thank you. Oh, yeah, Anna.
But I was going to say as well that sometimes people say, oh, well, who cares, about literature or about movies? A little bit more, because people watch movies or series for different reasons, sometimes just to relax. But we know from literary studies that people can understand better problems through fiction as well. So you would empathize more with a character that is a refugee, in the case that I put of Anne Frank, than maybe if you watch the news in the Dutch TV when they talk about the people in Ter Apel that are refugees equally as Anne Frank was. But we don't have that book yet that transformed people empathy. And sometimes people don't make the connection. But, these things are important for us to grow as human beings. That's the role of literature. And so creative content is not only for enjoyment, it's also for growth.
Yeah, I think that's a very wonderful summary, actually, and why I think we can all relate that it's very important, the research that you're carrying out. And we already mentioned it, of course, but we are working on artificial intelligence, or as we call it, machine translation and creativity in translation. What do you think about the role of machine translation, artificial intelligence in translation, and specifically in creativity research? Anna, can you maybe give us a bit more information about that?
Yeah, well, AI has become so ubiquitous in our lives that sometimes it generates a rejection because people say, oh no, AI again. What? I don't want to hear about AI anymore. And I have a bit, I mean, we all have a bit that feeling because AI is sometimes used in a very generic way. So in our case, I think we focus more on the capability of any system, any computational system, to produce a translation. So this could be statistical model, it could be a neural model, it could be a large language model, it could be a small language model. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but that's what we work for. Now with generative AI, we also can see how interacting with generative AI might improve your translation, for example, because you could produce a translation potentially and then try to improve it through its style. So we have done some experiments, for example, trying to prompt large language models to be more creative by giving different prompts, maybe the author, maybe the genre, maybe this type of research. This is what interests us. So is AI in translations something? It's very difficult for a researcher to say, to take these sides that is AI good or bad. I cannot position myself in this dimension. For me, I have a tool in the same way that, when I started translation, I was using WordPerfect. I have a tool. This tool is much more sophisticated than has ever been before. So I cannot diminish the wonderful achievements of computational linguistics and computer science on this. And I just try to see how beneficial or not beneficial is for certain things. So for me, AI has a role, especially with end users. We have done some research on how people use machine translation, for example, when they arrive to the Netherlands in a health context. And it's very, very useful for people. So we cannot deny that AI has a role, and it has a role in content as well. Many of us, or at least me, have used machine translation sometimes to translate from Swedish a series that I wanted to know what was the series about, But of course, we also want to see what is the role, how humans can benefit from this AI, and not only one side of the picture. That could be a company, or it could be, even AI developers. They have their agenda. We are trying to see how this AI affects the user and the translator and the ecosystem where the translator is. Like Xiaolu was saying, the payment. Is it fair if you spend a lot more time trying to fix something because it's creative? And yes, you did post editing, but you spent so long that a discount might not be applicable here. You know what I mean? So I don't know if I answer your question, but that was my...
Yeah, I think you really answered my question, but also very curious about what the PhD candidates think, because they are working on a small part of the project, of course. So maybe Nastya can tell us more about it.
Yeah, well, it's quite a big question to answer, and there are many things which I now learn and study in my project, and actually how AI and machine translation affects translators and their process. But I agree with Anna that I also see AI more as a tool, which is already a big part of our lives, and it affects everything that we do. But I also, maybe as I said in previous questions, there is so much information also around AI, which also I think affects the translators and also us as the researchers. And this is not only how the tool affects us, but also everything that is around this tool. But again, I'm also open and curious about what translators have to say about it. That's why I also interview literary translators, asking them a bit about what they think about this new technology. So I hope I will understand more about it as a result of my research. The role of AI, as Anna said, it can be positive or negative, we don't know, but it's here and affects everyone.
Yeah, and I think most people have used maybe ChatGPT for something, like to formalize an email or whatever, or translate something, like Anna said, from Swedish so that you can understand the series that you're watching or reading about. So, Xiaolu, can you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, from my perspective, if I am not a researcher, if I'm just a subtitler, and this is also what I heard from other subtitlers, So AI can be used only if the texts are very technical. So in audiovisual translation, for example, companies' introduction video or some documentaries, which are simply aimed at educating teenagers by presenting some like scientific knowledge. So then the productivity can be improved because creativity usually doesn't play a role in this kind of technical text. So in this way, translators only need to correct a few errors that the machine made. So I think that is, from my perspective, that is a role of AI in subtitling in audio-video translation.
Yeah, thank you, Shalu, for adding this to what already has been said. And Kyo?
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what has been said. And I think, especially if you're thinking about AI, it's so broad. Like, even if you only think about machine translation, so asking either Google Translate or prompting ChatGPT or something with translation, there's still so much that can be done. Like, you can just throw in the entire text and say, translate it. But you can, of course, also, for instance, if you don't understand a certain word or a certain phrase, or you think something has cultural meaning in a certain language, but you don't really know about it, or they mentioned on a holiday or something, you can also use these tools to kind of get more information, both as the reader of a text, one who reads the translation, but also as the translator itself. So I think there's a lot of, it's just a very broad thing nowadays, and it's very ubiquitous. Like, I think almost everyone has at least used ChatGPT, but even Google Translate is using neural machine translation networks. So there's just a lot of these technologies everywhere, and they are, as I mentioned, very broad. So I think it's also just very important to understand what works and what doesn't work. So I think also what Nasha and Xiaolu are doing to look at how translators engage with this. And that doesn't mean, okay, do you like the entire translated text or not? But also, okay, so where might it be useful for? And I think that's also part of our podcast, to kind of ask, okay, so what tool would you like, or how do you already use AI in a certain way? And in which ways do you like it or not? And I think this broadness of AI is also something that we easily forget, because if you use ChatGPT, it's all in one tool. So it's just easy to think, okay, we can just throw all of it in there. And that might not be best use or have the best effect on our translations. But I think, as was also said before, like, it's not necessarily a case of will we use AI for everything or for nothing. It's also to understand, okay, what are these effects? And it doesn't even have to be in good or negative, but you can also think, okay, people are more efficient, but translators don't really like editing the machine translation first, creative post editing that has been seen in some research. But it's also maybe easier for some text or for some parts of the text, or again for like a cultural significance. So I think it's good to look at these things because they're both so broad, and we have to kind of understand better how to integrate them, perhaps. Because I also think, even though I think it's good to be critical of like AI and MT and how we use it, and especially the impact it has on the translators industry and translation industry at large, I also think it's not something that's really gonna go away anytime soon. So I think it's very important to just understand how we can best engage with it and how we see these kinds of translations and its role and influence on translation.
And if I may say something that has been mentioned several times, it's here, AI is here. But the way knowledge works and research works is that something is here, and with the information that we provide as researchers, hopefully that here will be better used or better employed. So we are trying to transform opinion, not only society's opinion, but also show companies and translators our findings. We want to share what we see, because we know as researchers, in the research that we have done, that whatever a person thinks their productivity is not necessarily what the productivity is when measured. Or where people say, oh, I try to be as creative post-editing as translating from scratch, we know that even if they try, sometimes that is not achieved. Even if you're convinced you did a great job, even if you're convinced that machine translation did not help you, sometimes it does help you. So this is not about opinions. What we do is more to gather data that will help others to understand how this works, how translation works, and how creativity works in translation.
Yeah, and I do agree that it is very important. And I think the developments regarding AI, machine translation, have developed at such a fast pace over the last so many years that I think, and it can be very beneficial, like you said, Anna, for people. So I think it's good that there is research to help people understand the role of machine translation and also the role of human translation and why that is also very important.
And there has been research, for example, all this research about gender bias that now everybody talks about gender bias. But this started in academia when somebody said, machine translation is biased, is gender biased, and then companies picked up on this research and started to look how their systems could be less gender biased. So it's not like, oh, AI is here to stay and we have to live with it sort of thing. We have to see what is the best way to live with it if we want to live with it. If we don't want to live with it, maybe we should argument why this is not possible. There is a real influence that we can make. This is also part of the podcast, that we want people to also understand these layers of knowledge. It's not so simple in a way. A lot of people say, when I talk about AI, some people have told me, oh, you are against AI, and I've been doing research on machine translations for 20 years, or whatever, 15. It's because I like it. But of course, that doesn't mean that I have to accept everything that comes with it, right? So I think it's important that research is here to do that.
Yeah, I do agree, because the objective role, so to say, of research. So I have one final question for you all. What has surprised you the most about the research you started? And what did you expect and what did you not expect about the research? So Kio, could you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, so I did pilot at this point already, which we hope to publish somewhere in the beginning of next year, hopefully. But so I looked at how readers, as I mentioned, how readers react to the different versions of one translated story. So I had one English story and it was translated by a person, by the machine, and then edited by the person again. The machine translation output, then the final one. I think there were two things that surprised me most. Firstly, so we also conducted interviews after the reading with these readers to see what they thought of it. And what surprised me a little bit still is that with the post-edited text, so that is the machine translated output that was edited, people really still, they understood the story. So the narrative itself was understood, but they didn't like the language. So that was what people kept saying, that they felt it wasn't Dutch in this case, it was a Dutch translation, that they still felt if something was off. Even if they couldn't pinpoint it, it still felt off, which was interesting to me because it had been edited, as I mentioned, by a professional translator. So you'd expect the text to be better, or at least good enough. But still, I think also they mentioned, because it was a story, the literary story, they felt something still was off and they felt it didn't flow that well, or there were just something weird about it. So I think that was very interesting, because you still kind of expect an edited text to be better, but I think it might just be that a text is useful, but that the language might still be a little off in what you expect from a literary story. And the other thing which surprised me was that if you look at engagement with how people engage, you do see a strong engagement with human translation. So people like the story, the text, the phrasing as well, which is almost off in machine translation, because people just find machine translation, it becomes funny because there's so many weird errors or phrases that don't work. So a brief example, in my text, there was good gravy in English, and it translated basically to beautiful gravy in Dutch, mooie jus, which everyone who read that text just had to laugh at because it makes no sense and it's so ridiculous. So you kind of get these weird instances where people just react differently to these kinds of stories. But yeah, I think that was the most surprising thing. So the way people still notice the weirdness of the text and how weird a text becomes sometimes in machine translation, which you not always notice.
Yeah, I do understand. And it's good to hear that we can already read about your findings beginning of next year, hopefully. And Nastya, what do you have to add?
So for my part of the project, I interviewed translators, and I first gave them a short literary text to translate. And then I also interviewed them about the process and what they thought about it. And a couple of things surprised me. First, I expected people to be different in how they approach the task, the text, and what they think, but I maybe didn't expect that they will be that different in how they react towards the text they had to translate. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it at all, but the amount of emotions it evoked in them, it was very interesting to witness, because they really approached how deeply some translators went into the text, learned about the author around it, and others maybe approached it more like just a work or task. So it's very different how they react towards the text itself. But also another thing is what they think about actually the technology and machine translation, because also maybe I had this feeling that literary translators, they would be negative towards the technology, but it surprised me that they use it a lot and it's already a part of their work flow, and they really use it and rely on it. And also maybe I didn't expect that some people use ChatGPT for translations a lot. For example, I didn't expect it from professional translators. So I think also the interviewing professionals also broadened my perspective on this, on how also technology can affect their process and everything. So I think these two things were the most surprising for me.
Yeah, I think that's the funny thing about research, right? That you hypothesize something and that sometimes you find something that is really different from your own expectations or the hypotheses you thought of. Yeah. And Shalou?
Yes, I just want to add something that is more general. So what surprised me is that working with people can be trickier than expected. And things often get more complicated than I would imagine. So for example, so many unexpected situations have come up, like some personal issues or like COVID, something like this, that affects some participants.
I also do just kind of add to that what I, in general, about research, and especially I think this research is also we use nouns for these things, translation, translators, the text. But I think what you realize in translation, and I hope, but I also think this podcast does, is kind of humanize everything. Everyone, we're all doing experimental research with participants. And I think what we start to notice as beginning researchers is just how everyone is really their own person. I feel like that's a little bit trite or cliche to say, but every translator, every reader is their own person, is an own individual. And I think that's also something that's sometimes easily overlooked, the individual differences in how people approach tasks, texts, translations, and how we all engage with it. And I think that's also something, especially for the translators, that we want to do with this podcast. And in general, I think it's always good to remember that we're all individual people and we all have our own preferences and way to approach things. But I think that's really something that stands out in this research when you look at translation, that it does, it is made up of people, of individuals. So yeah.
Beautiful addition. And Anna, what do you have to add? Because you have more experience, of course, in translation and research and creativity. Yeah.
Well, it always surprises me, first, that I never get bored of participants' accounts of creativity or how people describe their process or their experiences, even as readers or viewers. I find that quite fascinating. And I do still find technology fascinating, even sometimes I don't understand the technology behind some aspects, of a neural network. I always say by the time I figure this out entirely, they will come up with something else. But all these things fascinate me. But I think maybe for other PIs out there, I think the incredible effort of putting up a project that it might appear when you read an article that will come out as very, oh yeah, they did a research with 20 people and blah, 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 okay, they find this. The incredible effort that we have put into bringing this project to life, not only all the preparation to get funded, but to hire all these wonderful researchers, to hire all these wonderful professionals, and to make this coherent, to make a project that it makes sense for everyone. It's very, very difficult. I have worked a lot with large projects as a translator, but you get so incredibly happy when you get funded to do the research that you like, that you kind of forget that they are going to be very stressed for quite a bit of time. So it's a lot of work. Yeah. And sometimes I wonder, I think, and then we are going to produce this small, in inverted commas, water in an ocean of information, right? But that's the nature of research, a drop of water in the ocean. So I encourage people as well that might listen to this podcast to read the articles. And we should also make it more, public engagement activities to disseminate our work, because I think we put a lot of effort, a lot of money from the European Union to make these things happen.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people can benefit from this research. I speak for all of us that you're really doing a wonderful job as a principal investigator for this project, Anna. So I think we have come to the end of this Christmas special. And I think I can speak for the audience, but also for me, that I've learned a lot about your research. And I think, like Shalou already mentioned, it's good to maybe thank the people that have participated so far in the podcast, but also to thank our participants for the first work package and also for Kio's research. So thank you all very much for making the first year and a half of the project a success. And I would also like to thank our audience. So thank you all for joining today, and also thank all of you to telling us about your research. And I think there's one thing left to say, and that's that I wish you all happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and a wonderful New Year.
Thank you, Lisette. Merry Christmas to everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you again to our invited speaker, and to our listeners. Thank you for being there, and feel free to share our podcasts with your family, friends, and colleagues. This is part of a series of podcasts of the EU-funded INCREC project. So follow us for more episodes, and please share your comments on this platform. See you next time.